Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Back in the early 80s, I worked at an all-night gas station close to the Kentucky Dam. You may have guessed already that yes, this story takes place during the midnight shift, and it was the same business I worked at when first hearing about what the beast of the land between the lakes had supposedly done to an unsuspecting family while camping between the lake area. These incidents happened before and after the knowledge of the beast, but keep in mind that knowing of a creature that could possibly exist in the surrounding area did not perk my imagination nor spark hallucinations. Whether they merely happened by coincidence or by chance, they happened nonetheless. The following events add to my already established genuine, abiding regard concerning those mysteries that are left undiscovered and unapproachable out in the dark of night. To this day I carry a healthy respect for things that go bump in the forest, and treat others similar stories with the same consideration. Several times during the midnight hours of my first summer working there I would hear what seemed to be a woman screaming. This echoing sound would come from the marshes that surrounded the gas station and would continue into a slow rolling roar that would have sent chills up the spine of even a deaf man. Many people told me it was just a bobcat, which had been spotted in the area before, and to be cautious when crossing the parking lot to use the restroom, pick up litter, or do some general cleaning outside at night. I never got used to that lonesome curdling shriek that would erupt the silence of the early mornings. Sometimes it would come from way off in the distance, out of a line of trees that ran along the borders of a large creek. Other times it was closer, coming from the blackened swamp areas, and sometimes it was too intimate, like it was just behind the building I was working in at the time. There was never any warning to its beginnings. The shrillness of the volume would fill the humid air in the summertime and hang on like an eerie floating adhesive, sticking to everything it could adhere to and continuing reverberating like the rasps of a beached whale. When the bellowing outcry was within the boundaries of the parking area, it would make my legs shudder and grow weak. There was no getting used to this animal's selfish display of needed attention. Whatever it was, it could not be seen as the outside light poles only illuminated the four corners of the lot. The land up to the concrete curbs that squared off the property was lost in the darkness of nature. From down the road or from the nearby interstate, the service station looked like a small four-sided box with lights in the corners and a tiny building in the center of the lot. The closer the outcries were, the more distinguished the tones, and I couldn't help but compare the sound to what an old biology teacher of mine would do to get the class's focus at times. He would take these fist-sized geode rocks that had been busted in half, revealing large protruding crystals from the inside, and scrape them across the blackboard, one in each of his hands. The ear-piercing screeching did not cease until he had run the length of the 8-foot slate. It was a hideous torture to the senses, enough to make your teeth hurt, put goosebumps on top of goosebumps, and make you squeeze your bladder in while a trembling of microscopic marbles shot up your spine. The effect left everyone in a quivering state on the verge of momentary lunacy. Besides being quite deafening, it produced separate tones of raucous discord. Some crystals formed a variety of high-pitched abrasive sounds, while the larger ones created cantankerous, lower, gravely vibrations. All of them mixed together in some insane symphony. This was the sound that the unseen animal in the marshes would broadcast through the stifling heat of the summer nights. Its secret invisible visits happened with great frequency at first, and then the events would die down and then disappear altogether, not revealing its intolerable cries for months at a time. The next spring it started up again, but further away this time in another section of fields that lay beyond the marshlands and closer to a government tree farm. It wasn't long after it made its presence known again that the two officers came into the station with the tale of the campers found torn to pieces in the land between the lakes. Myself, having been born and bred in a large city up north, did not want to fancy the notion of the alleged beast being a Bigfoot or a werewolf, but fashioned my opinion around more logical explanations: bobcat, bear, or wolves. Blaming an unknown hairy creature in the forest for being the culprit was not a fathomable answer to someone who grew up in the concrete and steel jungles around real monsters called murderers. Even though several years prior, while visiting one summer in Kentucky, not far from the Kentucky Dam at my aunt's house, there was an encounter with a very unexplainable life form that knocked my logical thinking into the ground. This particular event left me more confused than afraid, and I had to change my way of perceiving certain hairy beast legends in a new light. But that is another story. Nonetheless, the idea of a bobcat, beast, or a stereotypical movie monster doing that amount of damage to a human being sparked my uneasiness over hearing a possible relative lurking in the shadows around me where I worked. Besides, I knew that the typical murderer usually didn't give out a war cry quite as unnerving as this one did. So I knew it had to be in the animal category of the food chain. Summer passed with the occasional screeching howls in the background of the quagmires. They would still send me into an instance of cowardice and anxiety, but knowing the being was so far away gave me a hollow sense of security. It wasn't until the late autumn, when the thick fogs began rolling in off the boggy mires, that a foreboding panic would invade me to the very marrow of my bones and create within me a lasting impression of authentic terror. I had somehow made my way through the dense mist, mostly by memory alone, to the restrooms that were on the back of the lot to replenish the supplies and do some regular cleaning. Because the weather made it impossible for travelers to drive and see at the same time more than a few feet in front of them, I saw it as a great opportunity to get some work done, knowing I would have very few customers, if any. It was well into the early morning, around 3 a.m., and I was inside the women's restroom slinging a mop when I heard a new sound, very different from the one of the bobcats. This one was like someone was riding a bike outside that had playing cards attached to the wheel spokes with clothespins along with balloons rubbing along the same turning tires, riding slowly, methodically, creating a sort of rough clicking growl. Maybe it's a car with a really bad muffler, I thought to myself, wondering how it had found its way through the lot, or even found the driveway for that matter. Just as I was putting the mop into the bucket to squeeze it through the wringer, that old familiar scream was heard once more. Right outside the small building I was presently in at the time. The bucket turned over from the jerk I gave the mop after being startled overhearing the animal at such a close range. The bleach from the spilled water climbed through the air and stung my eyes, but I couldn't blink, couldn't move any part of my body at the time. I just stood there staring at the door, waiting, listening. The beating of my heart seemed so loud I thought that the animal outside might hear it. I really wasn't aware of how much time had passed as I kept that paralyzed stance, trembling as if freezing from a wintry breeze. After a while of listening to its grumbling, low stifled growls outside the door, I heard a police siren in the background, coming from the road. I could tell the vehicle was going at a slow pace, and I could just imagine it trying to creep through the cloudy atmosphere towards an accident, no doubt. The animal's commotion ceased from the other side of the door, and all went quiet except for the wailing of the sirens that seemed to be coming directly from across the station out on the road. A few more moments later I heard another scream from the same animal, but this time it was further away, like it had retreated back into the wet bogs. This was my cue to get the hell out of Dodge and back inside the safety of the front office building. Hastily I mopped up the mess on the floor, grabbed all the cleaning stuff, and made my way back through the thickened clouds using my internal compass to the main building, locking the door behind me. The police car was still going down the road, but its sirens seemed further away by now. About 30 minutes later, after calming down a bit from the encounter and while taking some inventory, I saw a shadow from the corner of my eye run past one of the windows. It shook me up a bit, and I turned to concentrate on any more movement from outside. Again the shadow ran past, but this time in front of another window. The building I was in was surrounded by 3 sides of glass windows, and was actually quite small compared to other gas stations. It was all self-serve and there were no garages attached. There was room inside for a few candy racks and a couple of large coolers to keep sodas and sandwiches in. There was also a back storage room, but it was more of a walk-in closet size, and then there was the cubicle up front surrounded by bulletproof glass where we conducted all the money transactions and stored cigarettes. The shadow was very tall, way taller than the average man, and was rather large in stature and moved in a bouncing motion as a man of sizable bulk would move when trying to jog, and it appeared to have a coat on or at least something bulky. I heard a trash can turn over, heard debris scatter across the concrete, empty glass soda bottles, used oil cans, and the rattling of other things. Then heard the same can crash into one of the gas pumps outside as if something had picked it up and hurled it. This was no bobcat. This was someone having some fun outside at my expense. Anger began growing within me as I was thinking that this was not a very humorous practical joke, and I actually yelled out loud my dislike of the whole scenario. This isn't funny. Laying my clipboard down on the counter, I began looking out the windows, straining to see the mischief maker again, all the while double-checking to make sure the doors were locked. It was standard procedure to lock the doors after 10 p.m. and serve the customers through a sliding drawer, much like a bank teller at a drive-through service lane, inside the bulletproof cubicle. While peering through the middle window, that same methodic grumbly growl introduced itself once more from outside. I was momentarily confused. Was the bobcat back? Could the idiot outside hear it? Was there danger in store for the stranger who was trying to tease and terrorize me? The grumbling sound traveled around the corner to the back end, and then the building shook from a massive hit to a wall. I could hear some stored items fall off their shelves and deposit themselves all over the floor in the storage room. There were no windows in the storage area, thank goodness, but there was a back door. I raced back there and started stacking cases of soda and boxes of oil against it to secure it even more. There was a low mumbling on the other side of the door, and the sound came from up high, what seemed like around the top of the doorframe. A low and deep-toned breathing could be heard also as I just stood dumbfounded staring at the grayish-brown steel door. Two deliberate solid thumps met with the door from the other side like someone who had just pounded on it with their fist, and along with it came that unceremonious squall. This was no bobcat. Nor was it some intimidating prankster, my mind screamed. In those few seconds, a parade of memories sped through my brain, each of them crashing into one another as they raced to the finish line to see who would win, sanity or insanity. The image of an upright wolf-like creature that I had seen years before at my aunt's house, howling on top of the hill, was fighting for position with an overly large bobcat, and then the vision of a Bigfoot was lumbering alongside them. All the words from the two officers' stories from a few months before echoed inside my head as these pictures within me created a macabre movie. Dizziness overtook me and I fell backwards onto some other cases of stacked sodas. I remained there for the longest time, not knowing what to expect next, not really wanting to know actually, and definitely not wanting to go back into the other part of the building where I or it could possibly get a better look at each other through one of the many windows. That terrifying thought was brewing, when through the open door facing one of the candy racks I could see a shadow moving along the right side of the building, slowly through the fog. It was like not having your glasses on and trying to make out what something looked like through the entire blur of an unfocused silhouette. Then briefly, ever so quickly, a considerably large hand materialized and reached out from its secret form in the mist and touched the window. My first thought was gorilla, as in just that glimpse I saw the darkened nails, the blackish-brown leathery skin, along with long dark hair hanging from behind the knuckles, spreading up the wrist, and up part of the arm that seemed to be floating in the whiteness of the fog. Then it was gone, replacing the horrifying scene with silence for the remainder of the morning. I dared not move, or maybe I didn't think I was actually capable of motion. Either way, I remained on the stack of sodas for the few hours I had left on my shift. About an hour before the next crew member was due to arrive, the newly dawned sun began burning off the fog, making it retreat back into the marshes, back into the pores of the earth, like the ghosts of the undead. It was only then that I cautiously made my way outside and cleaned up the mess from the thrown trash receptacle. My mind was still trying to rationally explain the hours before, but unconsciously I had already decided that the events would remain hidden within my memory, never to be discussed, only to stay buried under the clouds of my own inscrutable mystical fog. That decision did not last very long, as within a few weeks I had transferred to the afternoon shift, with a new guy taking the midnight shift. It wasn't a few days later after this change that the new guy started telling me about the sounds and howling he would hear from the night before. I reassured him it was probably just a bobcat, and his reply was, "Yeah, right. I've lived around here all my life and I never heard no bobcat ever sound like that." It was then we struck up a conversation about local Bigfoot stories, and I then confessed as to what I had experienced a month prior. Needless to say, it totally freaked him out and he started having a friend come up and keep him company during the midnight hours. He never actually saw anything, but the squalls would continue every so often, about once a week, and then it died out altogether by the time winter rolled around. I believe that in these days and times of the world, the ridicule endured for these types of witnessing tales is not as straining as it used to be. It is acceptable now for people to come forward and tell of things they have seen or heard that are completely foreign to a logical explanation. The truth is out there, and most of us know it or have witnessed something to help substantiate the basis for the truth to be honestly believed.
The summer of '88 will always be a turnabout in my beliefs of real monsters versus the demonic or paranormal type, when a new avenue of fear introduced itself and made a permanent pathway inside my mind. It was on one of those hot July summer evenings in Grand Rivers, Kentucky, back in 1988, when this took place. Grand Rivers is at the beginning of the land between the lake's entrance. The sun was not completely down. I was staying at my aunt's house with my cousins for a few weeks during summer vacation, a very welcome home at the end of a dead-end road. Hundreds of acres of woods surrounded the home that had been built down a hill and into the side of a large hill of dirt. There were several homemade trails throughout the woods that led to several places, an old abandoned railroad track that went on for miles, another abandoned place, the old sawmill, and other paths led to parts of the shoreline of the Kentucky Lake. They all started out as walking trails, but with the new addition of a dirt bike that my cousin Joe had, the trails became well outlined and defined. As with almost every day that I was visiting, Joe was out riding his bike through the woods, exploring, and just being with his own thoughts of a 15-year-old. His younger sister, Rhonda, was with me outside on the porch swing. She was 10, and I was 13 at the time. My uncle was working and my aunt was at the local IGA store down in town. Beside the driveway was a huge dog pen where their pet basset hounds lodged and was at the moment quite relaxed in the shade. The woods had been filled with only the sounds of birds and the chatter of squirrels for a few hours. Joe must have been way far off on a trail somewhere to not have heard that distinct sound of the dirt bike screaming through its gears echoing around the trees. I knew he must be on his way home, because his dad forbid him to be out in the woods at dark, so Rhonda and I were waiting to hear that familiar putt-putting of the bike slowly coming down the drive as he reluctantly came home to park it for another night. As we swung back and forth, we heard something a bit strange in the distance. It was Joe's dirt bike screaming at almost a soprano type of gear, long, steady, and fast, with no shifting sounds, just a straight stream of one gear in motion with a full throttle, going at top speed. The sound accelerated as he drew closer at such a fast pace, and we watched from the swing up to the top of the driveway where he would appear from the other side out of the woods. I couldn't help but think that he had better slow down or he would come flying up over the top of the hill and downwards, missing a wide stretch of pavement by being airborne. The noise didn't soften or slow. Steady and fixed was his speed. And just as I had thought, he emerged from the woods in such a tenacious movement, that he did indeed go airborne a few feet before pounding down the front tire on the driveway, continuing his descent now with a struggle of keeping the bike upright and straight. Rhonda and I jumped from the porch swing and got out of the way as we didn't know where he was going to stop or in what position. The brakes hit hard and the bike slid sideways, and as it came down to the edge and end of the drive, Joe tilted his body and let the bike slide out from under him before he went down the rest of the hill with it. Instead of the bike continuing to slide to the edge, it was caught in a spin that variably died down as the engine sputtered, and then quit altogether. Everyone was wide-eyed and full of adrenaline, all our mouths open in shock. But Joe's mouth was open in a strange fearful grimace. He was sweating profusely and his breaths were coming and going in great heaves. Tears were coming down his cheeks, mixing with the dusty dirt that the trail had left him powdered with. His eyes were at the top of the hill, at the top of the drive, unblinking, searching, waiting. We followed his gaze, not understanding what this escapade was all about. In silence we watched with him for about 30 seconds, and then the dog started barking, growling, and then whining, trying to get out of the pen in a frantic panic of digging and gnawing at the fencing. It grabbed me. "Look at my leg," Joe screamed, making us jump with alarm at the sound of his voice. We looked down at his Levi's and saw scratch marks going across his right thigh, scratches that tore through the tough denim and left small bloody marks on his skin. The marks were like a bear claw rake, not those caused by branches or sticky bushes, but a definite wide pattern of a paw print. It walked on two legs. His voice startled us again, as he was trying to tell his story in between huge gulps of air. He was frightened beyond belief, and the bits and pieces of what he was striving with extreme effort to tell us were coming out in loud syllables that filled us both with the same dread. It was following me through the woods along the path from the old sawmill. Hairy. It was so hairy, and its snout was so long, and it walked on two legs. It ran on two legs. His voice was sputtering, slowing, his eyes were still wide, and I could see the pulse of his heartbeat throbbing under the skin of his temples. A howling began. From the woods, not from the dog pen, where now the dogs suddenly stopped their own complaining, standing deathly still, staring up at the top of the hill, the nape of the hair on their back standing up, ruffled, their noses up in the air, breathing in a strange scent. Then, a wolf's howl. It was close. It seemed it was just a few yards from the road up above. Just as the idiot in a horror movie stands and stares at something to appear, that was what I was doing then, with a mixture of anticipation and confusion. What the hell was he talking about? I thought to myself, mulling over the brief descriptions: torn blue jeans, walks and runs on two legs, stalking him, hairy with a long nose, and calling the mysterious hunter an it. Joe's tears came quicker and he started to push us towards the front door of the house, demanding that we go inside and lock the doors. He had a hand on each of our backs and was urging us onward when it came out of the woods above. At first it appeared to be a very large wolf emerging from the dark outline of the trees, but as it approached the one-lane road that connected to the driveway, its height grew to a towering shadow that stood on two legs. Much taller than a man's height, maybe by a foot, and with the sun gone down behind the clouds, it only cast a silhouette of blackness, hairy blackness. My mouth dropped wide as well as my eyes. This was not happening. This was not what I was seeing. My mind was going back and forth from rationality to reality. It raised its long snout up in the air and let out a gurgling, slow, deliberate howl. One of the creature's arms bent and shaded its eyes from the glare of the security light above it. It wasn't an it any longer, nor was it a Bigfoot. This was a wolf-like creature that, like Joe said, stood on two legs, was taller than a man, and was staring at the three of us down the hill. Those huge, black eyes, I will never get out of my mind. They were like two sockets of ebony oil shining under magnifying glass lenses. We ran into the house, tearing the screen door in the process, slamming the main door, locking it, pushing things, anything we could reach against the inside of the door. The kitchen was right behind us, and so was the knife drawer, which we raided and took several with us as we tried to decide where to hide. There was a house dog inside, another basset hound, Stubby, and he met us in the kitchen wondering what the racket was. Another howl from outside, coming from the driveway. Stubby's hair raised and he started backing up at first, then he went to the front door and was smelling around the edges. The three of us ran to my aunt's room and were about to slam the door and lock it when the dog tucked tail and ran after us, beating us under the bed. All of us squeezed under the four posters, knives clutched in our hands, scared half to death. We could hear the dogs in the pen outside going absolutely crazy with barking, and we could also hear other things being knocked around on the porch, then on the side of the house, then at the side door. We heard glass break. We could tell it was from one of the bedrooms. The windows were up high and they were very narrow, so we knew that it would take some effort for anything to get through them, but still we shivered from fright. Then my aunt's horn on her Cadillac sounded several times as she drove down the road and approached the house. That meant for us to meet her outside and help with the groceries. We didn't budge. We couldn't move. We didn't answer her yells from outside for us to come unload the bags. We didn't crawl out and unlock the door for her, nor answer her knocking. She finally had to use her keys and then give some hefty pushes against the pile of items we had up against the door, the trash can, 25-pound bags of dog food, water jugs, and a variety of other stuff. We stayed put. She discovered us only after all the groceries had been brought in, and she noticed that her bedroom door was closed and locked. It was amazing that we hadn't cut each other in some way or another with the immature use of the knives in our haste to hide, and we were chastised in more ways than one when it came down to my aunt observing us slowly emerging from her bedroom with the kitchen weapons in hand. We all started talking at once in a fervor, then we finally let Joe tell his story first, then we finished with breaking a window just before we heard her horn on the car. She must have been startled by it. She didn't laugh, she didn't respond at all at first. In fact, she never said a word until she came back from inspecting the windows in the bedrooms. My aunt said indeed there was a broken window, broken from the outside in. She made us clean up our barricade and put up all the groceries. Later that night, after we were all in bed and my uncle came home, she related that evening's events to him. The next morning, their dad warned us, "Stay out of the woods." No problem. He went on to say that he himself had gone down in the woods earlier at morning and found several pits dug and filled with animal bones and parts of carcasses along the path that led to the old sawmill that couldn't be explained. There were also holes dug in the sides of the bluff along the hills that overlooked the old mill that looked like deep caves, big enough for a man to hide in. Then he told us that years before, when the old Boy Scout camp used to be on the other side of Grand Rivers, that an unexplained creature with wolf features was seen along the water's edge close to the campsites. He and his older son had witnessed it themselves one evening. I went back home a few weeks after this happened. And since then it has never ceased to be a moment of complete terror lodged inside my mind. Not too awfully long ago, in the late 90s, my uncle and my dad, who had come down from Missouri to visit, decided to venture into those same woods in front of my aunt's house. They took a couple of pistols and 2 rifles and were gone for several hours. These were 2 brave men, the bravest I know of, both of whom served in the military and fought in wartime. These 2 men came back ashen-faced and bewildered. They had walked all the way back to the old sawmill. The pits, fresh ones, were still around, filled with the bones of forest animals. The holes in the bluff are still there also. They both experienced the feeling of being watched and felt an uneasiness that something just wasn't right. The area where the sawmill was had no life stirring around it. No birds, no squirrels, no crickets, no bugs, even the small pond was still and lifeless. They couldn't shake the feeling of being observed by a secret watcher, and both swore they saw a large black shadow lurking in the shade of one of the mysteriously dug caves. That had been the first time they had been down that far on that side of the woods in many years, and both of them agreed that it was to be the last. My dad said there are some things you just can't explain, that science doesn't know about, and these things should be left alone, they are not a part of our modern world. He felt that whatever it was that had scared the shit out of us so many years ago, still existed in the same area. His intuition has never been wrong so far. Urban legend? Maybe some of the stories passed along the years have been added to, stretched a bit, like all local folklore, and first-hand stories are over time. My story wasn't an urban tale though. It was a first-hand account of something I really and truly do not want to believe in, and wish I could forget, erase from my memory, because the nightmarish image remains real even though the events are still unexplained by the laws of science as we know it.
I currently live in southern Illinois with my husband. I grew up in rural Lyon County, Kentucky, and at home in the woods and around the water. My dad and I spent many weekends fishing. One early April 2001 morning, when I was 14, we pulled the boat out of the slip and headed south into Lake Barkley. It was an extremely overcast day with a heavy fog. In fact, we almost canceled that day. About an hour after we moved into the river, the sun broke through the clouds and the fog started to lift. So Dad said he wanted to try out the brush piles in one of the shallow bays off the land between the lakes area. Dad pulled in into one of the bays and dropped anchor. We then started fishing off the brush piles. I can remember that we were landing crappies and were having a very good morning. After an hour things slowed down, so we decided to have some lunch. We sat in the boat eating about 100 feet from shore. I think it was close to noon, but I'm not positive. We had finished eating and Dad started to pull the anchor when we heard a loud splash. We looked towards the brush pile and, again, there was a large and loud splash. Dad thought someone was throwing rocks, so he said that we needed to find another location. We started to pull off towards the main lake, when I happened to catch a look at a man walking along the shore after it walked from behind the brush pile. Then I noticed that this was not a man because it had hair over its entire body. It was Bigfoot. I yelled at Dad and he looked as I pointed towards it. He cut the motor off and we sat there watching the Bigfoot throw rocks into the water. It looked like it was trying to hit something. We watched for several minutes as the Bigfoot moved in and out of the brush and shore. Dad wanted to get closer so he could take a picture on his phone, but I was scared and begged him to leave. The water was shallow and I was afraid it would get mad and attack us. He tried to get a photo, but for some reason the phone wasn't working correctly. We then noticed that there was a smaller boat heading towards us. There was a man on the motor. As he came near, he cut the motor and looked towards Bigfoot. He definitely saw it because he looked back at us with a surprised look on his face. Dad was alarmed and said that we're leaving. By this time, he was upset that someone else had seen us observing Bigfoot. He recognized the man in the boat. My dad was well known in the area and he was worried what would happen if his name was associated with a Bigfoot sighting. When we got home that evening, we told Mom what we saw. She was upset as well. That's as far as the story went. I was told to never tell anyone what we had seen because it would create problems. I told the story to my husband not long after we were married. His reaction was favorable and he has shown interest in what we saw. I guess we can refer to ourselves as Bigfoot enthusiasts. This is why we listened to you and Sean, because we were aware of your encounter and have listened to your podcasts. That's my story. I wish to remain anonymous, mostly because of my parents' fears of ridicule.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.